we are veering into a arena where the protection of pre-viable fetal life at all costs, we're going to start to feel those costs very soon.
Like what? What do you think are the costs of something like that?
The cost of that, in my opinion, first and foremost, you have to understand that in order to enforce Tennessee's abortion ban in a meaningful way, Tennessee will have to begin attempting to prosecute healthcare providers from other states. Why? Because abortion itself has evolved. Abortion used to be limited to a surgical procedure. That surgical procedure would have been very easy to control because you'd know where it was happening. In 2000, the FDA approved medicated abortion, which currently is still approved for use via a telemedicine visit with a provider anywhere in the US who can mail that medication directly to a patient. All of that is perfectly legal in a state like Massachusetts and federally. The patient in Tennessee, in this example, couldn't be prosecuted under the law. It exempts patients. The only way to stop that from happening and actually ban abortion is to attempt to exert our influence in Massachusetts. Well, Massachusetts knows that, and they're the first state that recently passed what's called the SHIELD law. And their law, Massachusetts, says we will not recognize arrest warrants or extradition capacity for our doctors if they engage in this type of healthcare.
Because they would have to be extradited. That's so interesting.
So what you get is the erosion of interstate cooperation. The last time we saw this in this country was what led up to the Civil War. You had southern states that had slaves. You had northern states that did not. It was a fundamental question of who gets to make the rules over an extremely divisive moral issue. And occasionally, human beings who were kept in the South as slaves would escape to free states. And free states had laws that would not return those human beings to slave owners because those free states considered it morally abhorrent. It eventually led to the Civil War. It led to such an erosion of interstate cooperation and commerce that our country went to war. We are on the precipice of that now. When you understand that, of course, abortion and slavery are completely different. Slavery involved the murder and selling of human beings as chattel. However, the analogy and understanding historically that the fundamental question of who gets to make the rules can result in a fracture among the states that is irreparable. That's the true cost of this law. You don't pass laws for sport, you pass laws to enforce them. The only way to enforce this law in modern day is to exert influence outside our borders. When we begin to do that, we fall apart. Tennessee and Missouri are tied in this country for bordering the most states. We begin to erode that cooperation and our economy will fall. We have worked as a state for decades to perpetuate policies that bring businesses here, that grow our economy. It's one of the reasons why we have such a thriving society and such a thriving economy. It will crumble. It will crumble over our intent on enforcing this law to protect pre-viable fetal life. That's the cost. So I think Tennesseans need to be asking themselves, am I willing to give up my job for pre-viable fetal life? Am I willing to give up my security, my safety, my values, my community? Am I willing to watch it burn? Because I can assure you, the special interest group behind this legislation, they are.
That's what I was going to ask you next. Tell me about Tennessee Right to Life, because as I started to ask around at the State House, I realized no one in the State House actually wrote this law.
Correct.
Tell me who wrote this law.
This law was written by a gentleman named Paul Linton. Paul Linton is an operative for Tennessee Right to Life. He's an attorney who doesn't live in Tennessee, has absolutely no stake in our economy or the safety of this community. He lives in Indiana. He is a hired gun. He wrote Tennessee's law.
And everybody's law, actually.
Yep. That's why you recognize when you read it that they all use many of the same phrases and terminology. This is a group that has evolved from a faith-based organization, which in my opinion is one of the greatest types of organizations in Tennessee. I think we do an amazing job here of incorporating spirituality and our faith into our policymaking in ways that are productive and not violative of the constitutional amendment against separation of church and state. However, Tennessee right to life has evolved. In the same way, for example, that abortion has evolved to include medicated abortion, Tennessee right to life has evolved from a faith-based organization to religious extremism. This is an organization that believes it is on a mandate from God to protect fetal life at all costs. That's a very, very frightening group of people to be in a position of power. When you have folks directing policy for whom the ends will always justify the means, you should be afraid. Very, very concerned. We have seen what happens in other parts of the world when religious extremism begins to dictate policy. There is no cost too high to fulfill what is perceived to be a mandate from God. And in this case, that's what's happening. That is what's happening in Tennessee. And if we don't control this and rein it in, we're at risk of losing everything that we've worked for as a state.
Yeah. What do people need to know when they hear your side of this, how you say, look, I mean, this is kind of hanging in the balance. What do people need to do?
People need to vote, and people need to pressure their representatives to follow through and represent their interests. They need to speak up and speak out. In my humble opinion, the issue is not really about debating the merits of the abortion ban. It's about discussing the consequences of enforcing the abortion ban. When you understand that whether you consider yourself pro-choice or pro-life, which I think is a really outdated construct, most Tennesseans and most Americans find themselves somewhere in the middle. No matter what your view on access to abortion, I think it's really important that Tennesseans understand, unless we speak out and speak up and demand representation consistent with our interests, this is going to get away from us. And I think the key to that is staying in touch with your representatives, staying in touch with your community, and making sure that your voice is heard on this issue, and understanding it's not about morality or religion. It's about economic stability and a continued way of life that is threatened by laws that are, written by religious extremists.